I want to welcome everyone. I'm Joe Brooks, director and founder of Community Works Institute, and we're here for another Spotlight series today with our wonderful guest, America Montes de Oca. And the title of today's session, with a whole lot more than that in it, is Developing Language, Creativity, and Voice Through the Arts. As you learn, the arts, photography, and language acquisition are what America is all about. As an educator, America, who I was fortunate to meet at a CWI Institute more than a year ago, although it seems like yesterday, at Otis College of Art and Design, she focuses on developing students' language and creativity and voice through the arts and integrating her approach to that. She has a teaching credential from Loyola Marymount University in secondary education. But I think what's really notable to me is that her bachelor work, Bachelor of Arts, was in Chicano and Chicano Studies and Art with an emphasis on photography from California State University. And we're going to come back to that because that's really significant because that is, as I understand it, the first university and maybe college in the United States to offer a Chicano Studies program. And
yes.
It's influenced, I know from firsthand experience with so many educators I've met in the Los Angeles area, had a tremendous impact and influence. So welcome.
Thank you, Joe, for having me.
You want to add to the introduction? Is there something folks should know?
You said it pretty well. You introduced me pretty well. So that is pretty much me and what I'm currently doing.
Okay. So we might as well start with our current reality. So
yes.
I did fail to mention that you're a 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. No, 6th and 7th. 6th, 7th, and 8th. That's right.
6th, 7th, and 8th.
Yeah. So what we would understand to be a middle school teacher of visual arts and language development. You teach both as separate courses, but you've been encouraged by your administrator, and I'd love to meet him or her, to integrate both of them in these two classes. And that's a great thing. It's a small charter in the Los Angeles area, part of Los Angeles Unified School District. And in Eagle Rock.
Yes, in Eagle Rock.
Somehow or other on the east side of Los Angeles.
Yes.
So, what's it like out there right now with virtual teaching? Because you've been, like a lot of folks, but not all, you've been teaching virtually completely since March, April?
Since late March of last year. So I remember the day, and I want to say it might have been March 17th of last year, where we were told that we were not going to return due to the pandemic. So they had us prepare, that couple of days before that Friday, before leaving off into virtual teaching, they had us prepare a whole, well, actually it was prior to spring break. So they had us prepare a whole 3-week lessons for students to do from home. The expectation was that we were going to return after 3 weeks. That was not the reality. It's been over a year and a half, so it's been pretty interesting. It's been interesting, just last year at the beginning of the pandemic, it was very stressful. The last semester before going on to summer break, it was pretty stressful because there was we didn't know what to expect. There was a lot of, still trying to figure out virtual learning and teaching online. How did that happen? And how would teachers go about, teaching students online? Over the summer, I felt like we had a better expectation of what the fall would look like. And, I started preparing for that and planning, and things just got a little easier over time. I'm now currently in this place where I feel very confident and very, comfortable teaching online. But trust me that it took me a long time to figure out the whole teaching online and, finding resources and having to deal with all kinds of, links and setting up, virtual folders online for, students and classes. So it was a process. It was hard. It's hard transitioning from teaching in person to teaching online. And it was quite a bit messy at the beginning because we didn't know what to expect. But, with the resources out there and with our support from our administrators, I think we got where we needed to be, to a place where we're actually, you know, teaching online comfortably, and we're, are able to present the information in a way where students are able to access it.
And as I think anyone who's paying even slight attention knows, there have been huge equity issues across this country. How much has that been a factor? And without too much of the tech details, do all of your students have access, we're going to guess, to Chromebooks and whatnot, but do they have good access to online, to connectivity? And how much is a factor?
Right. So, not gonna lie, that is a major issue. At the beginning of the year in the fall, every student had a laptop, a Chromebook available to them to pick up. That was great, great news that every student had access to that technology. But the issue is, like you mentioned, is the internet. How good of an internet that they have at home. A lot of students, have struggled and still struggle till this day with, Wi-Fi issues and not being able to, hear me properly because, their connection in their apartment complex or wherever they're located at, their hotspot's not properly working. And I think that has to do that, a lot of that has to, obviously has an effect in the learning of students. There's a lot of students who definitely lost, they were discouraged. A lot of students lost interest because having to deal with these tech issues. So that's the reality that we are currently facing, that there's still students who, miss my Wi-Fi is not working properly.
And teachers too.
And teachers too. I had to go and buy additional internet. I don't know what the word is, but anyways, I had to buy more internet, and it just made my life so much easier because at the beginning of last year, my internet was the worst, and I had to work from outside, out in my patio where I had more, the best, more internet quality. But if I was to come to the back house, my internet was really poor and I would drop, and yeah, it was a mess, but had to figure it out on my own. And I could only imagine, what students are dealing with, at home with everything having to do with virtual learning and accessing things online. Because for me as a teacher, it was very challenging, and I could only imagine that for our students.
And in a household with a lot of family members and or other kids, it's
Yes.
a no-brainer that it's just going to go off the tracks. So we could talk about the whole virtual teaching thing, which I think we want to come back to.
Of course.
But I think in terms of how you've made this work with, you teach a number of classes. If you could sort of walk us through some of the classes that you just teach in a quote unquote normal setting before the pandemic, and and don't worry about the virtual piece for now. We can sort of double back to that. Tell us about some of your classes and how you're integrating them with language acquisition and English language learners. I mean, separately or together? I know you're doing both.
Right. So, like I mentioned before, I'm teaching visual arts, and I was also given the task of teaching ELD early on this year. In my ELD class, like I mentioned prior, we were given a curriculum by our school district, and I love the curriculum. But, unfortunately, sometimes when you think about ELD curriculum, it's very cut and dry. And there's, it's just straightforward information. And sometimes it becomes very repetitive and very, for lack of a better word, boring for students. And I am happy that my administrators were giving me the opportunity of integrating art. I have my administrator, Mr. Sanchez, who pushed me to integrate art into ELD. And he was like, hey, I understand that, this curriculum we gave you is not, it's the information that students need, but it's not what students currently need. And they need something to grasp their attention and their interest. And I felt very encouraged by him and very supported. And I'm like, hey, if you give me the okay to do that, I'll go ahead and, take control of my ELD class and integrate arts. And in ELD, it's, it's my ideal like art appreciation class for me. I want to say, we learn about art history. We learned about how are we able to talk and, describe artwork. So in a sense, like art criticism, we learn about artists and we talk about artists and we talk about artwork. And, it's just all about art and how are we able to incorporate, those language skills that students need, like talking, speaking, reading, and listening. And, that's what I'm currently doing for ELD, and it's working so far. I am, maybe 6 weeks into the semester. And for the past 6 weeks, I've been doing that and it's been working great. Students seem to like the integration of art into ELD.
And why do you think, it's not why, but how, I guess, do you think, what's the connection? It's the personal piece for students when you bring art and photography and
Right.
thinking about
Right. I think it's a personal connection to art. There's a connection. I think as a human, you're connected to art naturally. And when you are being told or you're being asked to, just describe an art piece and give your opinion on it, I think every student feels comfortable doing that and feels comfortable talking about art and describing art. And I think there's a natural interest to art. And I feel that's what students like. My focus, I like to definitely include a lot of like art appreciation and talking about artwork, using the skills, like I mentioned, the skills that they need to learn how to use or just further develop. And I think that's where it becomes interesting to them instead of having to go through a regular traditional ELD curriculum.
So I'd like to come back to this, but maybe a good segue, jumping ahead a little bit, is, we're basically talking about how to connect and engage students with what they're going to learn, should learn, want to learn. So let's hear a little bit about your own personal educational background. I mean, going back to K to 12, and none of your teachers are listening, except the one you really loved. What engaged you when you were a middle school student?
What engaged me?
We're not entirely present in middle school, but just
exactly. You know what? I'm not going to lie. I was not the best student through, elementary, middle school, and high school. Like, I was more interested in art and music, and I always think about art being like my strength and just me, just being so involved in, artwork and creating. And that was my interest in, in middle school and high school. And I think, looking back at middle school, and I'll mention a little bit after, but I was very, I was very lucky to have teachers who cared about me. And it's interesting because my middle school is actually the current middle school that I'm teaching at. And I don't think I ever mentioned this, Joe. So it's interesting, just, looking back to where I came from and to where I'm now at. Reflecting on that is just a great experience. Like I said, I wasn't the best student, but I did have a lot of support and a lot of teachers who really cared about me. And what was my favorite class in middle school and high school? I'm not gonna lie, it was the arts and music. That's what it was for me.
not algebra?
Not algebra, no.
Me neither, but let's not pick on algebra. There's some great stuff, but
Yeah.
just never found an application for it during the.
Of course, yes. I mean, I think algebra is a little fun now as an adult, but as a kid, it was just so hard. I remember taking, I had to retake algebra or maybe take an additional algebra class to catch me up in middle school. Across the street, Florence Nightingale And I loved that algebra class, but yeah,
Why did you love it?
it was just fun, I was like, oh, I finally understand math. And, I was always a little behind in math, and going, taking that algebra class at, summer school at a different middle school, and going back to, the fall semester, going back to my regular school. It was like, oh, I finally feel prepared. But, you know, that wasn't always the case. I wasn't always good at math, and definitely in high school, I kind of lost interest. But
Well, we don't want to go off on an algebra jag, but let's just say it wasn't my favorite subject. But then I wanted to build stairs and a roof, and all of a sudden Pythagoras came forward. They just never really mentioned the connection. Okay,
right.
so let's move along from algebra. But I think the point is practical application and connection. So, but then I think the other thing to talk about is, if you could, is then you end up, I guess you were at Cal State Northridge, which is in the heart of the San Fernando Valley here in the Los Angeles area, and before that, or after that, Loyola for your master's. But things happened for you at Cal State Northridge.
Yes. Like I mentioned, I was not like the best student, and I think senior year, or must have been 11th grade, like towards the end, where we're starting to apply to colleges, I ended up applying to quite a few Cal States around, in California. And I got into a few of them, and I was like, you know what? I don't want to be too close to home. But at the same time, I don't want to be too far. And I think it's a typical thing for a college student to do. So I ended up going to CSUN, and I dormed there. And the interesting thing about CSUN is that going into CSUN, I was undecided. So I went undecided, and I had the opportunity to enter CSUN through the EOP program. And the EOP program had a really wonderful summer bridge program where it helped students transition from high school to college life. And, during that time, I had the opportunity of taking a Chicana Studies class. And at that time, being a freshman, during that summer bridge program, I was like, what is this? What is Chicana Studies? And once I started to kind of learn about, that history and that aspect of what it meant to, what the word Chicana mean, it kind of gave me empowerment, and it kind of, taught me a little bit more about my own identity. And that's where, my passion, or my interest in the Chicana Studies came from. And I decided to, eventually after my first or second year, I decided to major in Chicana Studies and art. So I did a double major at Cal State Northridge, and, I just went with it. And I think my main interest was in Chicana Studies, is when taking these classes, I saw something that I didn't see in myself before. I was being, I think there was like a representation of who I am and people like me. And I think that's where I was like, wow, there's people out here with the same, background history, and the same experiences. And it was very powerful. I met a lot of great people in that program, and till this day, I'm still friends with them. And it's just, like I mentioned, it's just something that it gave me power to me, and it kind of gave me a little bit more to identify myself with.
Yeah, I've been really fortunate to have met a number of graduates of the Chicano Studies program at Cal State, which I think, as I said, I think it's the oldest. I don't know if it's ethnic studies or Chicano studies.
Yes, I believe it's one of the oldest ones in the Cal State system. I know it was earlier on, it was developed sometime in the 60s.
Yeah.
And then
right immediately after the moratorium and
yes.
East LA walkouts and the Brown Berets, etc.
Yes. And I had the opportunity of having a lot of great professors who, were part of that, building that Chicana Studies department at CSUN. So
Gabrielle,
it was great.
For example.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we had a lot of great professors. And the funny thing is too, not funny, but also I had the opportunity of joining Mecha when I was at CSUN, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, and it was great. Like it, it was such a powerful feeling to be around students who had the same interest and same passion and education, and I thought it was great. Like I mentioned before, a lot of I met a lot of friends through that program and through that organization. And it's funny because at that moment I didn't realize it, and now that I reflect and go back to it, I think we all wanted to be change makers. And one way or another, looking back, I'm like, wow, all these people who came from this program and from CSUN, one way or another, they're impacting their communities. So that's a great way to look back at CSUN. Sorry,
It's
you're
an
muted.
awesome, no, it's an awesome thing. And you don't really see, I don't think you see great things with short-term impact, maybe sometimes, but when you see the long-term impact, Ivania invited me out to Mecha's, was it the 50th anniversary, maybe, out.
Yeah,
And I don't know, near
I believe, was that a
last,
couple years ago?
well, everything's a blur with this COVID.
Right.
I think it was last spring, not this past spring, the spring before.
Hmm.
And a lot of the folks who are now in their 70s, many of whom were Vietnam vets and were part of the Brown Berets and the walkouts. And in fact, the guy that actually was the first guy to walk out, they were all there.
Yeah.
It was powerful stuff.
I'm telling you, like stepping into those classes and being taught by these professors who have walked the walk and been out there in their communities and empowering the communities, I was like, wow, that's amazing. So a lot of that feeling transferred off to me. So I've carried, it feels good to carry that with you throughout, your education and your career. And I think a lot of that I still have. Obviously I'm still carrying myself with that same feeling of passion and wanting to change and be a positive change maker.
And, whether, Chicano or any ethnic group or, white suburban kids or something else, I don't think most students ever have that experience of being put directly in connection with, important moments in time, change makers. That's what we're about, but it doesn't happen typically. And
Right.
it's great to hear you talk about it. So then you go on from there and you become, and you also had an emphasis in photography. Why photography?
Mm-hmm.
Where did that come from?
I love photography. I originally wanted to do my own photography business and just take portraits and do some fashion photography. And I was doing that a little bit after college. I was, taking photography and, doing small little jobs here and there while still working. Um, but at some point I was like, hey, like I want to do something else, something that I feel like it's going to make an impact. And I decided to just, take a chance and go back to school. And that's where I entered LMU and the credential program with the masters, and that happened, and now I'm here. But there's a lot that goes into that. Funny thing is, I don't know, you heard me mention earlier on I currently teach at the middle school I used to go to. And through PUC schools, they developed a partnership with Loyola Marymount University where they are able to take in, you know, their alumni and kind of, develop them into teachers. And, one day I received this email in my email, and it says, alumni, currently we have an alumni program where you're able to receive training to become a teacher at one of the PUC schools. And I was like, hey, that's my opportunity to, be, be a positive impact in someone's life. And I just went with it.
That's a great thing. And look what
Yeah.
they got, an amazing teacher. So you told me, you mentioned a few things.
Hmm.
It's clear what propelled you, and then some serendipity and various things happen. That's always important. But you were talking about some of the classes that you're teaching, some of the projects you're doing.
Yeah.
And, as I asked you earlier, I mean, being a photographer, being an artist, we can see the art behind you.
Oh,
And know
yeah.
that you're an artist, which is wonderful, by the way.
Thank
Um,
you.
I would think that you have a more natural orientation towards project kind of thinking. If that's,
Yes.
project-based learning is a huge thing out there.
Mhm.
So one of the things you mentioned was visual journaling. Tell
Visual
us about that.
journaling. Yes. So it's funny because originally my original lesson or unit of study was going to be color theory coming into springtime after winter break. And then all of this happened, in our country, the riots at the US Capitol, and it was just a lot happening, a lot to process after winter break that I was like, hey, let me allow, instead of teaching kids, about color, which is important, and theory, color theory, which of course is important to have as an artist, I was like, let's just create art about what's currently happening in our country and in our society. And I created a unit around current events and social justice issues. For our first visual journal, like I mentioned before, I based it on what was currently happening in our country. And my inspiration came from, January 6th at the US Capitol. And it was, taking it all in and being able to digest it as an adult is very hard. And I'm like, only imagining what my students are going through and what are they thinking about this specific event and other events connected to this. So I decided to allow them to explore a little bit more into visual journaling. And I introduced the concept of visual journaling, where they're able to write down and, do writing and visuals to express a thought, an idea, or some kind of theme. So I, went ahead and rolled with it. And we read a little bit in art class about this specific event. I allowed them to reflect on it, and they created an art piece around that.
And you shared, because you use the amazing and cool app Padlet, you shared some of that
Yes.
with me earlier when we were talking, and might be good to mention we're recording this, and so we'll get it up on CWI's YouTube channel and have some examples of that artwork, because it's very powerful. What a great idea! I mean,
Yeah.
but bringing it
And
right into the moment. How they
right.
react? I mean, what was the difference between that and some other thing you did that maybe didn't ever get complete liftoff?
Um, for this, it's my second time trying visual journaling, and this time around, I knew that students had a lot to say, but didn't have the opportunity or space to voice their the thoughts and feelings. So they loved it. They went with it. They reflected well on it, and I just allowed them to, I taught them the concept. I gave them some background information on it, and I just allowed them to go with it. And their work, it's amazing. They were able to share their thoughts, their ideas, their feelings, visually and written.
What always interests me, not to put you on the spot because it happens when it happens, is that sometimes in these moments where something is more immediate or it's more personal, we see students that normally are going through the motions, if that, who suddenly sort of rise forward. Did you see any of that? You know what I'm talking about?
Yes. I did see that because, like I mentioned, every student had something to say, and it was amazing to read their, I asked them the question, what are your thoughts and feelings on this event? And almost every student had something to say. And I was like, wow, like coming from sixth, seventh, and eighth graders, like this is amazing to read and to see that these students are able, they're young, but they still have a voice and they still have an opinion. And things like this is a very powerful impact in them.
Yeah, yeah. Any particular examples you want to talk about?
Any particular examples? I know it's been a couple weeks since we've done that journal, but let's see. Let me look at the Padlet that I had for a couple students.
You had no students that were oblivious to this.
No.
They were all very tuned into it, and
they're very tuned in. They all had something to say. You know, they obviously, even though they're young, they understand the situation, and they're. I'm so happy to see that they will be very positive citizens of our society later on. But it's great to see that they, at a young age, know what's right and what's wrong.
because their age group. I have a 20-year-old, and your kids are a whole different generation. Actually, they don't watch the news.
Oh, they don't.
So they're getting it from Instagram, TikTok, and wherever, and they've got their own set of channels where that information is coming down. And there's no talking head moderator like Anderson Cooper telling them, "Oh, well, here's what happened, blah, blah, blah." Right?
Yes. And you know what? And I think it's interesting now because most of, their family members are now at home. So information is being shared so much differently. And, it's different, once everyone's in their own little bubble, but like everyone right now is currently at home. So information is going by fast. So if mom and dad is watching the news, they must be having that dialogue at home, which is great.
Yeah.
Aside from social media and all of that, but I do believe that there is a lot of dialogue going at home too around topics like that.
Yeah, my amateur research project, somewhat based on my own son, but just common sense once I talk with him, is that this next generation will have little or no use for mainstream media, at least a lot of them, and that they basically are going to have a hugely diverse set of sources that they make their own meaning out of and then reframe it.
Yeah.
And that all sounds like a good thing. So
I think so too. And I think that's the beauty of using what's currently happening right now and allowing them to reflect in their artwork, because art is just another way of communicating ideas and thoughts.
So before the pandemic, maybe during, but before, you're a veteran educator, you've been doing this for a while. What are some of your other favorite projects that you've done that you really enjoyed and your students really seemed to rise up and meet the challenge?
Yeah. One of my favorite projects to do is at the beginning of the year when I, just meet everyone, and just see them after, summer break. It's an identity art piece. So I like doing an identity art piece with each grade level, and it looks a little different. With sixth grade, it's more of an identity art piece of, who they are. And they create a really cool like name design with, with the things that it's interesting to them that, has to do with their identity. And these objects and things that kind of shape them into their, their name. So they create this really cool like name design. With seventh grade, I like doing kind of like self-portraits in a way. I call it the half-face self-portrait. So they draw or they paint themselves like half of their face, and then the other side of their face is kind of like a silhouette, and in it they have all these objects and things that represent who they are. And something similar I do with eighth grade, but overall I think that it's a great project to have students do because it teaches me a little bit about them, and it helps like they're able to kind of create artwork that it's about them and no one else. And I think that's a great way of kind of like catching their attention in art. What better way than to create artwork that's about you?
No, that sounds wonderful. Hopefully you'll maybe even share some examples if you can of that.
Yes, so I did share some examples. You'll see the Google Drive link. You're able to see some of the artwork in there.
Okay.
It's great. Yeah, it's amazing work that some students have created.
Terrific, and we'll include it in the video recording that we upload to CWI's YouTube channel. Before I move on to our next area I wanted to talk with you about, I mean, well, this identity thing is just absolutely huge and bottomless. And there are some of us that just, a lot of us, I mean, you've been part of the CWI community now and through events and so forth, and you know that there are a lot of folks who show up already kind of somehow getting it, and then it just gets deeper. No matter how much you think you get it, it's just deeper and deeper. And it's arguably the most important, I don't want to be speechifying, it's arguably the most important thing that we can do with students. And it's certainly where we should be starting as educators with students, because if we don't, there's a huge risk, in fact, with so many students that we never engage them.
Yes,
You
I agree.
want to comment on that?
You're spot on. I feel like it's, for me, I have a really large focus on making sure I involve students and making their art all about them and who they are. And it, has to do, obviously, I start off with the year, with identity art piece or their identity art piece, and whichever one I decide to choose depending on the grade level. And I allow them to explore their own identity and who they are as individuals. And I think it's a beautiful thing because sometimes kids are not asked that. They're not asked, like, oh, so who are you? Tell me more about you and who you are and what identifies you, and your family and their hobbies and things like that. And I think it's a great project to allow them to voice that and tell the viewer who they are as individuals.
And
And
then,
it
go ahead.
Oh, and it also serves as, them being reflective and kind of figuring themselves out too, because it's a hard question to be asked, like, who am I? Like, you know?
As someone who's been thinking about this for years, and it's an ongoing process, I think. But the next piece, I think it's the next piece, if it's a sequence, is so, okay, here's who I think I am. And then what is my relationship to what's around me? And, this large amorphous idea of community, but let's make it immediate, the community I live in. And
Mhm.
maybe you start with a family. That's a pretty typical primary school kind of activity. But what about connecting? You don't need specific examples, but what are your thoughts as a veteran educator on connecting the personal and the identity work with what's around you? And as some people would talk about this idea of belonging and mattering, that's a phrase that's out there that I like.
I I think for me personally as an educator, I think that's an important concept to cover in, with my students. I still haven't quite, you know, talked about like their place in the world. We're still going through that, but that's a great idea. I haven't thought about that. It's a very, big concept to grasp, and I could only imagine with my students, but I think I really have to sit with it and kind of reflect and see if I'm able to create something like that, because our students are very powerful and they have a lot of thoughts, and I know that each and one of them are finding their way in our society and how do they belong, and that they are part of this big thing, but each and one of them has one way or another is impacting our society. And I think that's a great question and great idea for a project.
And I fully recognize, in asking the question, probably should have before, but I do understand that's why, if one was in a middle school, for example, this would be a process over a number of years. And you couldn't be expected in the limited number of classes that you have to do all of this. It's a process in a series of stages and scaffolding, and kind of a hierarchy. But ultimately, it serves, I would think, a huge purpose to be understanding one's own personal identity. But I would also suggest that you can't fully understand who you are if you don't understand where you're from. Witness the Chicano Studies program that you went through, and how you relate not just to the Chicano community, but to the larger community around that. And it just gets bigger and bigger. And it ought to be a K to 16 enterprise. We're working on that. But
Yes, and it's interesting how you're mentioning that. It took me quite a while to kind of figure out my place in this world. You know, going into college, being a first generation college student, I had no guidance. And I'm not gonna lie, I felt pretty lost, half of the time. And I felt like I had to find my own way and kind of build my own path without someone guiding me. And now that as an adult, like I could start figuring, now have a better understanding of my place in this world and what I want to accomplish and, what impact I want to have. But it's a very interesting thing to think about, and how we are able to, allow our students or give students the space to start thinking about this at an early age. So,
no, absolutely. And understanding that it's, hopefully a lifelong journey.
yeah,
And some of us are still trying to figure out where we're going. It's a lifelong journey.
of course, I agree.
So I figured it out. I'm going from point A to point B, and I'm going to retire or whatever. Whatever it is.
Yes.
No, I you don't want to get me started on that. But I think you were I don't know, maybe it was familiar when you came to our next institute at Otis College of Art and Design, this idea of ethnography. That's very much which we worked on there. It's very much a part of what I'm talking about, this idea of perceptions. And you have your set of perceptions, I have mine, and they're based on a set of experiences. And there's some overlap there, and it's interesting to try to find that, and to get students engaged in that process. And you just can't do this with one teacher in 1 year.
Exactly.
That's
Yes.
obvious.
I mean, I could create all kinds of, especially this year being, teaching online and all of that. I'm trying my best to create art pieces that are around the lives and experiences of my students. And you got me thinking earlier on today about photography, and I'm like, wow, like I need to do some type of photography. I definitely want to do it, but I want to think about it more about them kind of, you know, recording and just documenting their daily lives and, their the things around them and their community. And I'm still thinking as of right now, and you got me going with, trying to plan something out for the future. But thank you for that. I definitely want to do something that students are able to have a good connection to and are able to, document their lives and things that are interesting to them and their communities. So thank you for that, Joe.
Well, no, thank you. I mean, I'm inspired by teachers like you. We won't form a mutual admiration society, but I really do mean it. I think you're among a smaller group of teachers, and hopefully we can help share your work, because I think there are a lot of teachers that would really get into this work if they could see what it looked like.
Right.
And certainly photography, and we talked about the Gordon Parks piece, that's something we'll come back to and we'll follow up with. What struck me about Gordon Parks, the famous African-American photographer, filmmaker, writer, composer, and generally Renaissance guy, what interests me about him, among many things, is that he was what I think of as a true autodidactic person. And in that, when he wanted to know how to do something, he taught himself. And, that we're not trying to set kids up to have to be in that position completely, but it's like if you can give them a taste of photography, and they were with you this year, and then they just run with it. That's the ideal, right? And you meet them 10 years later, and they're out on the streets doing photography in LA.
Yes.
That kind of
And that's amazing. And I think that's the best impact I could have with my students. Um, photography or anything related to the arts. The the main goal is to give them skills that and develop skills that they didn't know they had. You know, aside from like critical thinking and being able to view the art world and understand it, is just taking with them these skills that they didn't think was so important, but are able to serve a purpose in their lives later on.
Sure. I mean, I don't know if it's possible to find out, but I mean, if you were to talk to a lot of photographers, I would guess that a lot of them didn't think they were photographers until they were, and that's
Exactly.
probably true of people like Gordon Parks and Robert Frank and many of the greats. So, just a couple of other questions before we let
Mhm.
you go. Um, are there any projects ahead that you're thinking about, your sort of fantasy projects, even if you don't quite know how you're going to go about doing them? I'm putting you on the spot here. I didn't mean to.
Right. Um,
What's your fantasy project with students?
fantasy project. Well, there's a couple things that I am still trying to figure out, what I'm going to be teaching them. This year it's interesting, like everything that I, done with them, it's around, our current circumstances and, keeping in mind what do students have available at home. Um, So I'm obviously, like I mentioned, I definitely want to do like a photography unit. Next week, I want to do something around Black History Month and just have students explore a couple Black artists, and looking at their artwork and learning a little bit more about their artwork and the importance of it, and maybe create something in like an art piece that inspires them depending on that artist style. I'm still, like I mentioned, like I'm still trying to figure out what I want to teach them next. If I want to have them do I definitely want to do a drawing unit. In a drawing unit, there's a specific project that I want to do that's a window project, and they kind of draw what's outside their window. And I think it's a reflection of, our overall feeling of this pandemic and being stuck at home and being stuck in your room, but kind of looking outside and seeing what is going on outside. So I just, there's a lot of ideas and projects that I want students to, to like and, involve themselves in, that has to do with what's going on right now.
Um, this is kind of a non sequitur, but you made me think of several things. One of my favorite, I'm a huge fan of what some would call picture books. Um,
Picture books.
yeah. And yeah, I had several incarnations with picture books. We're not going to tell stories here right now, but I love picture books and they just get better and better. But one of my favorite artists, um, and who did books as well as an author, was Maurice Sendak. And you made me think, this is the non sequitur, that I don't know how familiar folks are with Maurice Sendak. I mean, he's best known for
Oh
Wild,
yeah.
and he's known for
Yes.
Wild Things, and
Hmm.
had the recent incarnation with the movie version of that they've been trying to perfect for years. But a lot of his art was really out there. A lot of
Yeah.
his picture books were really out there, very edgy, and the kind of thing that would make some parents maybe pretty uncomfortable. I mean, they were, I don't want to say scary, but they were edgy. And
Right.
but yes, and the wild creatures and all of that. But what's interesting to me, and I brought him up because I think he's one of the greats, and my
Yeah,
favorite.
it's great. It's
And,
at the
and,
work, it's awesome.
and they're kind of like monstery characters in a lot of his work. The monsters never win, but there's some creepy aspects to his work, but it's all good. Anyway, I brought him up because apparently he, like a number of great artists and writers, was very sickly as a kid. And he grew up in Brooklyn. And he spent a tremendous amount of time in his early years before he regained his health. I don't know what he had. But he had various things that were going around back then. And he spent a tremendous amount of time looking out his window. And that's what stuck with me. And some of his books reflect this, if you go and look at them, you know, because he became an observer.
Yes.
And he was looking out, I don't know, it would have been, I guess, the 30s and 40s, looking out on those crazy busy streets in Brooklyn.
Yes.
And he couldn't go out because he was sick. And that he became an observer.
Yeah.
And that was my strange, you know, connection to COVID time.
Yes.
That-
That's so funny because unit, and I'm like, okay, a lot of our kids are stuck at home. They can't, step outside, or when they do with family. But, a lot of the kids are stuck at home in their room. And I want them to kind of, as an observer, show me what's outside their window. What is your experience? What are you looking at? What's happening? And I think I, I really want to do this now that I'm thinking about it, but I think this opens up a lot because they're able to show, even if it's not there, they're able to show what's currently happening through this window.
Well,
So it's,
yeah, and I bet a lot of them, like me, have an alley out back. Not that I'm suggesting parents let them go out in the alley, but I'm a big grown guy, but I spend a lot of time walking through the alleys, and I've seen some pretty interesting stuff since COVID.
mhm.
So I'm not going to share any example. I've seen some pretty interesting stuff, and if I were a better visual journal person, maybe you can inspire me. I would have a collection at this point. So
Yeah, that'll be great. I mean, I'm always up to like teaching people how to do visual journaling. I'm no expert in it, but it's always fun to show other people.
it's a process, and one of the things I like most about you, respect most about you, America, is that you're willing to take chances and experiment. And trust me, nobody can appreciate that more than I do. I mean, that's where the sweet spot is. And if you're not willing, people who aren't willing to do that, I just don't think really interesting things can happen. So I want to, don't go anywhere. We'll hang around for a second, but I want to thank you so much for joining us today on CWI Spotlight Series. We've spent the last hour or so with America Montes de Oca, and we've recorded this, and we'll have it up on our YouTube channel, and along with some visuals from this amazing work she's done with her students here in Los Angeles, her 7th and 8th grade students. So thanks so much. And we have an upcoming Spotlight series on Sunday, and following on the Fridays and Sundays going ahead. So.
All right. Thank you, Joe, for having me.
Thank you.